the year of our Lord 1424, as the last light of autumn faded behind the hills that cradled the village of Little Thornfield, Agnes prepared for the most intimate ritual of her day. The fire in her small cottage had settled into gentle coals, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed this same ceremony countless times before. Her day's work was done, the bread baked, the animals tended, the evening meal shared with her husband Thomas and their young daughter Mary. Now came the quiet moment that belonged to her alone. She stood before the rough wooden chest that held their most precious possessions, her weathered hands moving with the reverence of a priestess approaching an altar. The clothes she wore, her only set of garments, would soon be carefully removed, lovingly tended, and folded with the precision that necessity had taught her. In a world where a new garment was a luxury beyond the reach of most peasantry families, the ritual of caring for what you owned was not mere routine, but an act of profound survival and hope. Agnes lifted her hands to the wooden pins that held her wimple in place. The white linen cloth, simple and unadorned, had covered her hair since her wedding day 15 years before. It was the same piece her mother had worn, and her grandmother before that, passed down through generations of women who understood that fabric was not merely covering but heritage, not just protection but identity. The wimple came away soft and familiar in her hands, releasing hair that had grown grey at the temples but still held traces of the auburn that had caught Thomas's eye so many years ago. The removal of each garment was performed with deliberate care, not from vanity but from the understanding that these clothes might need to last another year, another season, perhaps even a lifetime. Her woolen gown, dyed the deep brown of oak bark and woven on her own loom during the long winter evenings, was lifted over her head with movements that disturbed not a single thread unnecessarily. The fabric was soft from years of wear, shaped to her body's contours like a second skin that knew every curve and hollow of her frame. Beneath the gown lay her linen kirtle, the undergarment that protected her precious outer clothing from the oils and moisture of her skin. This too was removed with ceremonial precision, the ties loosened with fingers that could work by touch alone in the dim firelight. The linen was yellowed with age and repeated washing, its original white having mellowed into the cream color of old parchment, but it was whole and sound, mended where necessary with stitches so small they seemed to have grown naturally in the fabric. Agnes held each piece against her chest for a moment before beginning the sacred process of folding. In that brief embrace, she felt the weight of the day that was ending and the promise of the day to come. These clothes had walked with her through the village, had knelt with her in the church, had worked beside her in the garden and the kitchen. They were more than garments. They were companions in the journey of daily life, silent witnesses to joys and sorrows, protectors against the world's harsh edges. The wooden chest where her clothes would rest had been Thomas's wedding gift, to her carved by his own hands from oak that had grown in the forest beyond their fields. Its surface was smooth from years of touching, its corners rounded by time and use. Inside it smelled of the lavender she gathered each summer and dried in small bundles, a luxury that made the storage of her precious garments feel like a celebration, rather than mere necessity. As Agnes began to fold her kirtle, her movements followed patterns learned at her mother's knee, techniques passed down through countless generations of women who understood that the proper care of clothing was both art and science. Each fold was made with attention to the fabric's grain, each crease carefully placed to prevent unnecessary stress on the weave. The linen, worn soft as silk from years of use and washing, seemed to cooperate with her hands, folding naturally along lines that memory had embedded in its fibers. The medieval world understood the true value of cloth in ways that we can barely imagine today. Every thread represented hours of labor, the spinning of wool or flax, the weaving on crude looms, the cutting and sewing by candlelight when the day's other work was done. A single garment might represent weeks of evening labor, months of saving to purchase materials, seasons of careful planning and preparation. To own clothing was to possess wealth. To care for it properly was to preserve that wealth for future generations. Agnes's daughter Mary watched this nightly ritual from her place by the fire, her young eyes absorbing lessons that would serve her throughout her life. At 8 years old, she was already learning the sacred art of clothing care, understanding that the garments on her small body were precious beyond measure. Her own simple dress, cut down from one of her mother's old gowns, would someday be passed to a younger sister or cousin, its useful life extended through careful tending and mindful use. The gown was next, its heavy wool requiring different handling than the lighter linen. Agnes spread it across her bed, smoothing out the wrinkles with gentle strokes that honored the sheep who had given their fleece, the women who had spun and woven the wool, and her own hands that had shaped the fabric into this garment. The brown wool was rich and deep, its color achieved through days of careful dyeing with oak bark gathered from the forest floor, a process that had filled their cottage with earthy aromas and turned her hands dark for weeks. Each fold of the gown was made with mathematical precision, the heavy fabric arranged so that its own weight would not create permanent creases. Agnes had learned through trial and error that wool folded incorrectly could develop lines that no amount of smoothing could remove, marks that would proclaim to the world that the wearer was either careless or ignorant of proper garment care. In a society where appearance often determined social standing, such details mattered more than modern minds might comprehend. The sleeves of the gown required special attention, their length and fullness making them prone to wrinkles if folded carelessly. Agnes brought them across the bodice in a pattern that her mother had taught her, then folded the entire garment from hem to neckline, creating a neat bundle that would fit perfectly in her wooden chest. The movements were so familiar they seemed choreographed, a dance performed in partnership with fabric that had learned to cooperate with her careful hands. As the folding progressed, the cottage grew quieter, the sounds of daily life fading into the gentle hush that preceded sleep. Thomas banked the fire for the night, arranging the coals so they would provide warmth through the dark hours while consuming the least possible fuel. Mary had already been settled into her small bed, her own simple garments folded with the same care her mother showed, though with the quicker movements of youth that had not yet learned to savor each ritual of the day's end. The wimple was last, its white linen requiring the most delicate handling. This piece of cloth had seen 3 generations of women through marriages and childbirth, through seasons of plenty and years of want. Agnes folded it with the reverence due a family heirloom, understanding that she was not merely putting away a head covering, but preserving a legacy that would someday pass to her daughter and beyond. The completed folding ritual left Agnes standing. In her linen shift, her day clothes safely stored until morning would call them back to service. The wooden chest closed with a soft whisper, its careful construction ensuring that dust and moisture would not reach the precious garments within. In the dying firelight, Agnes whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the clothes that protected her, for the hands that had made them, and for another day safely concluded in the endless rhythm of medieval life. The ritual was complete, but its meaning extended far beyond the simple act of putting away clothes. In folding her garments with such care, Agnes was preserving not just fabric, but the very foundation of her family's survival, maintaining the tools that allowed them to face the world with dignity and protection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new demands on her time and energy, but her clothes would be ready, properly cared for, and respectfully stored, waiting to accompany her through another day in the ancient dance of human endurance and hope. The morning sun filtered through the oiled cloth that covered Agnes's window, casting a warm golden light across the wooden chest where her precious garments lay sleeping. As she lifted the lid, the scent of lavender rose to greet her like an old friend, carrying with it memories of summer days when she had gathered the purple flowers from the hillsides behind their cottage. But more than fragrance emerged from that simple chest. There rose the very essence of her life, woven into threads that held more than fabric together. Agnes lifted her kirtle first, the linen cool and smooth against her palms. In the gentle morning light she could see the history written in its weave, the slightly thicker threads where the spinner's wheel had caught, the subtle variations in color where different batches of flax had been used, the tiny imperfections that mark it as the work of human hands rather than the product of some impossible machine. These irregularities, far from being flaws, were signatures of the women who had transformed plant fiber into cloth, each variation telling part of the story of its creation. The linen itself had begun its journey in fields not far from their village, where flax grew in neat rows under the careful tending of farmers who understood the delicate balance required to produce fiber suitable for cloth. Agnes remembered the autumn when she and Thomas had helped with the flax harvest, pulling the plants from the soil by their roots to preserve the longest possible fibers. The work was backbreaking, requiring them to bend over row after row of plants, but the promise of new cloth made the labor feel less like toil and more like investment in their family's future. After harvest came the complex process of turning plant into thread, a transformation that seemed almost magical in its intricacy. The flax stems were first dried in the fields, then beaten with wooden tools to break apart the woody parts and release the precious fibers within. This was followed by hackling, a process that involved drawing the fibers through progressively, finer combs until only the longest, strongest threads remained. Agnes had participated in this work during her youth, her fingers learning to sense the quality of fiber by touch alone, understanding which threads would spin into strong yarn and which were suitable only for rougher uses. The spinning itself was winter work, done by firelight during the long evenings when outdoor labor was impossible. Agnes could still feel the rhythm of her mother's spinning wheel, its gentle whir providing background music to the stories and songs that made the tedious work bearable. Her own hands had learned the subtle touch required to draw out thread of even thickness, the delicate balance between tension and release that determined whether the yarn would be strong enough for weaving or so weak it would break at the first stress. She held the kirtle up to the light, marveling at the evenness of the weave that had been accomplished on the simple loom that still stood in the corner of their cottage. The warp threads, strung with careful attention to spacing and tension, had provided the foundation for the weft threads that were passed back and forth with a shuttle worn smooth by generations of use. Each pass of the shuttle had been followed by the firm pressure of the beater, packing the threads tightly together to create cloth that would be both strong and smooth. The transformation from thread to garment had required skills that Agnes was still perfecting, even after years of practice. Cutting the precious cloth required confidence and precision. There was no room for error when working with material that represented so much time and effort. The pattern pieces had been laid out with mathematical care, every scrap of fabric accounted for and used. What couldn't be incorporated into the main garment became patches for future repairs or smaller items like head coverings and undergarments. The sewing itself was meditation disguised as work. Agnes had learned to make stitches so small they were nearly invisible, each one placed with the precision of a craftsman, creating something meant to last a lifetime. The needle, one of her most precious possessions, moved through the fabric, with the rhythm of prayer, joining pieces together with seams that would hold through years of wear and washing. The thread she used for sewing was the finest she could spin, chosen for strength and smoothness, dyed to match the fabric so perfectly that the construction seems almost to have occurred naturally. Thomas stirred in their bed, his breathing changing, from the deep rhythm of sleep to the lighter pattern of approaching wakefulness. Soon he too would rise and dress in his own carefully maintained garments, beginning another day in the endless cycle of labor that sustained their life. His clothes, like hers, represented far more than mere covering. They were the armor that allowed him to face the world's demands, the uniform that marked his place in the complex hierarchy of medieval society. Young Mary had already awakened, her small body requiring less sleep than her parents, who bore the weight of daily responsibility. She sat quietly by the fire, understanding that the morning ritual of dressing was not to be hurried or interrupted. At her age, she was beginning to understand the value of the simple dress she wore, learning to move carefully to avoid tears and stains that might damage fabric too precious to replace carelessly. Agnes began to dress, the familiar weight of her garment settling around her body like the embrace of old friends. The kirtle went on first, its linen coolness a pleasant contrast to the warmth of her skin. The ties that secured it at the waist were made from twisted linen thread, their ends carefully finished to prevent fraying. These ties had been replaced several times over the years as wear and washing took their toll, but the garment itself remained sound, its construction solid enough to last for many years to come. The woolen gown followed, its weight substantial but comforting. The wool had come from their own sheep, animals that Agnes knew individually, whose fleeces she had helped to shear in the spring when the weather grew warm enough to make such work pleasant. She remembered the satisfaction of watching the thick winter coats fall away under Thomas's careful shears, revealing the pale skin beneath and providing the raw material that would eventually become the clothes that protected her family through another year. The wool's journey from sheep to cloth had been even more complex than the linen's transformation. After shearing came washing, a process that required careful attention to temperature and technique to avoid felting the wool into useless mats. The clean fleece was then sorted by quality, with the finest fibers reserved for garments that would touch the skin directly, while coarser wool was destined for outer garments and household items like blankets and cushions. Carding the wool prepared, it for spinning, aligning the fibers and removing any remaining vegetable matter that might weaken the eventual thread. Agnes had spent countless hours with wool cards, their wire teeth combing through the fleece until it formed light, airy clouds ready for the spinning wheel. The rhythm of carding was soothing, the repetitive motion freeing her mind to wander, while her hands performed work that was becoming automatic through years of practice. The spinning of wool required different techniques than linen, the shorter fibers demanding more twist to hold them together in strong thread. Agnes had learned to adjust her spinning wheel's tension and her own hand movements to accommodate wool's particular characteristics, producing yarn that was both strong and soft, suitable for the close contact with skin that a gown required. Dyeing, the wool had been an adventure in itself, requiring knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood the alchemy of transforming plant materials into lasting color. The oak bark that had given her gown its rich brown hue had been gathered in early spring when the sap was rising and the bark's tannins were at their most potent. The dyeing process itself had taken days, requiring careful attention to temperature and timing to achieve the deep, even color that would not fade with washing and wear. As Agnes finished dressing, smoothing the wool gown over her linen kirtle and adjusting the fall of the fabric around her body, she felt the familiar comfort of being properly clothed for another day's work. These garments, created through so much labor and care, would protect her from the elements while allowing her to move freely through the tasks that defined her days. They were more than clothing. They were the tangible expression of her family's industry, creativity, and determination to live with dignity despite the constraints of their circumstances. The threads that held her garments together were metaphors for the threads that held her life together. The connections to family and community, the links between past and future, the bonds of love and responsibility that gave meaning to the endless round of daily tasks. As she prepared to begin another day, Agnes understood that she was not merely putting on clothes but armor herself with the accumulated wisdom and care of generations, wrapping herself in fabric that carried within its weave the hopes and dreams of all who had contributed to its creation. As Agnes moved through her morning tasks, the weight of her woolen gown carrying familiar comfort against her shoulders, she found herself remembering the day when the cloth had first taken shape beneath her hands. It had been 3 winters past, during the darkest months when outdoor work was impossible and the long evenings were filled with the gentle rhythm of weaving. The loom had stood near the fire where the light was best, its wooden frame worn smooth by generations of use, its mechanisms operating with the quiet efficiency that came from decades of careful maintenance. The wool that would become her gown had been particularly fine that year, a gift from their best ewe who had produced fleece of unusual quality. Agnes could still remember the texture of the raw wool as she had first handled it after shearing, its crisp feel and slight oiliness speaking of health and good feeding. The ewe, a gentle creature with intelligent eyes, had been part of their small flock for 7 years, her fleeces providing the material for countless hours of spinning and weaving. Thomas had built the loom himself, following patterns passed down from his father and grandfather, men who understood that the tools of daily survival were too important to be purchased when they could be crafted with patient skill. Every joint had been fitted with the precision of a master carpenter, every moving part carefully balanced and aligned. The heddles that lifted alternate warp threads were strung with care, their spacing crucial to the evenness of the eventual cloth. The warping of the loom had been a community effort, requiring more hands than one woman could provide. Agnes's neighbors had gathered on a crisp autumn morning, their breath visible in the cool air, as they worked together to stretch the hundreds of individual threads that would form the foundation of the cloth. Each thread had to be measured precisely, cut to exactly the right length, and positioned with mathematical accuracy. The work required concentration and cooperation, but it was sweetened by conversation and shared purpose. Young Mary had been just 5 years old then, old enough to help with the simplest tasks, but still young enough to find wonder in the transformation of individual threads into useful cloth. She had been assigned the job of keeping the bobbins filled with weft yarn, her small fingers surprisingly adept at the winding process. Her questions had provided entertainment for the working women. Why did some threads go over, while others went under? How did the shuttle know where to go? Would there be enough cloth to make everyone a new dress? The actual weaving had taken weeks, progressing slowly as Agnes found time between her other responsibilities to work at the loom. Each day she would manage perhaps an inch or two of cloth, the shuttle passing back and forth with rhythmic regularity, the beater packing each row of weft threads tightly against its predecessors. The sound of weaving had become the soundtrack of their winter evenings, a gentle percussion that spoke of progress and productivity even when the outside world lay dormant under snow. Agnes had learned to read the quality of her cloth as it grew under her hands. The slight variations in thread thickness that gave hand-woven fabric its characteristic texture, the gradual development of pattern as colored threads created subtle stripes, the satisfying density that spoke of wool that would be warm and durable. Each flaw that appeared, a broken warp thread, a knot in the weft, a momentary lapse in tension, required immediate attention and careful repair. The wool itself carried memories deeper than her personal experience. The brown color that pleased her so much had been achieved using oak bark from a tree that had grown in the forest beyond their fields for over a century. Her grandmother had dyed wool under that same tree, using bark from its massive trunk to create similar shades for the clothes that had served her family through seasons of plenty and years of want. The tradition connected Agnes to generations of women who had stood beneath oak branches, stirring their dye pots and watching fabric transform from natural white to rich earth tones. The dyeing process itself had been a celebration of autumn's abundance. Agnes had gathered the oak bark in early September when the sap was still flowing and the tannins were at their strongest. The preparation required careful timing. The bark had to be fresh enough to provide good color, but dry enough to grind easily. She had spent days pounding the bark with a wooden mallet, reducing it to fragments small enough to release their color when boiled. The dye bath itself had been prepared with the solemnity of a religious ritual. Agnes had filled her largest cauldron with water from the spring that never ran dry, adding the ground oak bark in proportions her mother had taught her. The mixture had to be heated slowly, brought to a gentle simmer that would extract the color, without damaging the wool's fibers. The air had filled with the earthy scent of oak and wool, an aroma that seemed to capture the essence of autumn itself. The wool had been prepared for dyeing with equal care, wetted thoroughly and heated gradually to ensure even color penetration. Agnes had stirred the fleece gently as it cooked in the dye bath, watching the transformation from white to pale tan to the rich brown that would characterize her gown. The process required patience and attention. Too much heat would damage the wool, too little would result in uneven color, too long in the bath would make the wool harsh and difficult to work. She remembered the moment when she had lifted the wool from the dye bath for the final time, the rich brown color gleaming wet and beautiful in the autumn sunlight. The fleece had been rinsed carefully in cool water until no more color bled away, then hung to dry in the shade where the color would set without fading. The satisfaction of that moment had been profound. The transformation of raw materials into something beautiful and useful through the application of knowledge and skill. The spinning of the dyed wool had been winter work, done by firelight, during the long evenings when the day's other tasks were complete. Agnes had found a particular pleasure in watching the brown fleece transform into yarn under her hands, the spinning wheel humming its familiar tune as her fingers guided the wool into thread. The evenness of the yarn was crucial to the quality of the eventual cloth, each strand needing to be strong enough to withstand the stress of weaving, while smooth enough to create fabric that would be comfortable against her skin. The weaving itself had been a meditation, each pass of the shuttle requiring attention, while allowing her mind to wander. Agnes had found herself thinking of the women who had woven before her. Her mother and grandmother, great-grandmothers whose names were forgotten but whose skills lived on in her hands. The loom connected her to this chain of knowledge, its mechanisms unchanged through generations of use, its purpose as constant as the human need for clothing and protection. As the cloth had grown under her hands, Agnes had begun to envision the garment it would become. The brown wool was substantial enough for a gown that would last for years, fine enough to be comfortable in all seasons, attractive enough to wear to church on Sundays and feast days. She had planned the cutting carefully, laying out pattern pieces in her mind long before the weaving was complete, ensuring that every precious inch of cloth would be used to best advantage. The completion of the weaving had marked a significant moment in the family's year. The cloth, cut from the loom and washed for the final time, represented months of labor and skill, raw materials transformed into something that would serve them for years to come. Agnes had spread it carefully on their bed, smoothing its surface, and marveling at the evenness of her work, the subtle beauty of hand-woven wool dyed with materials from their own land. Now, 3 years later, as she worked in her garden, with the familiar weight of the wool gown moving with her body, Agnes could feel all those memories woven into the fabric itself. Each thread carried the story of its creation, from the sheep who had grown the fleece to the oak tree that had provided the dye, from the autumn gathering of bark to the winter evenings of spinning and weaving. The gown was more than clothing. It was a repository of experience, a tangible connection to the rhythm of seasons and the continuity of human skill and care. In the corner of Agnes's cottage, near the window where the morning light fell most generously, stood a small wooden stool worn smooth by years of use. This was where she sat each evening after the supper dishes were cleared and the fire banked. For the night, her mending basket beside her and her needle catching glints of firelight as it moved through fabric with the precision of long practice. The art of mending was not merely maintenance, but transformation. The skill of making the worn beautiful again, the broken whole, the damaged useful once more. Agnes lifted her gown's hem to examine a small tear that had appeared during the morning's work in the garden. The rent was minor, barely 2 inches long where a thorn had caught the wool as she bent to gather herbs. But left unattended, it would grow larger with each wearing, eventually compromising the garment's integrity. She smiled at the familiarity of this small crisis, understanding that such damage was not failure, but simply the natural consequence of a life actively lived. The mending basket, woven from willow osiers that Thomas had cut from the stream bank, contained the accumulated resources of countless repair projects. Small scraps of fabric saved from the construction of garments, their colors and textures carefully organized for future use. Threads of various weights and hues, some spun specifically for mending, others salvaged from garments too damaged to repair. Needles of different sizes, their points kept sharp through careful use and storage, their eyes polished smooth by the passage of countless threads. Mary sat beside her mother, her own small piece of mending in her lap, a practice cloth where she was learning the basic stitches that would serve her throughout her life. At 8 years old, her fingers were still learning the delicate coordination required for fine needlework, but her attention was fierce, her desire to master these essential skills evident in the careful way she positioned each stitch. Agnes watched her daughter's progress with satisfaction, seeing in the child's determined efforts the continuation of knowledge that had passed from mother to daughter for countless generations. The needle Agnes selected for her current task was neither the finest nor the largest in her collection, but one perfectly suited to the weight of wool and the nature of the repair needed. Its steel point had been forged by the village blacksmith, a man whose skill with metal matched her own facility with fabric. The eye had been drilled with care to allow thread to pass smoothly without fraying, its size calculated to create holes in the fabric no larger than necessary. The thread she chose was brown wool, carefully saved from the spinning of her gowns, original yarn. Agnes had learned long ago to preserve such materials, understanding that perfect matches for future repairs were often impossible to achieve unless planned for during the garment's construction. She had kept the thread wrapped in a small piece of linen to prevent tangling, stored in her mending basket against the day when its color and texture would be needed. Threading the needle required the steady hand and good eyesight that Agnes was grateful to still possess in her middle years. She had watched older women struggle with this simple task, their fingers trembling and their vision failing as age claimed these essential abilities. The thought reminded her to treasure these moments of competence, to find satisfaction in skills that might not always be available to her. The repair itself would require the technique called darning, a method of recreating the fabric's original. Weave by drawing new threads through the damaged area. Agnes began by carefully trimming away the frayed edges of the tear, using small scissors that had been her mother's and whose blades still held their edge despite decades of use. The trimming was precise, removing only what was truly damaged while preserving every thread that might contribute to the repair's strength. She started the darn by anchoring her thread in solid fabric beyond the tear's edge, her stitches invisible from the gown's right side but secure enough to bear the stress that daily wear would impose. The first threads ran parallel to the gown's warp, stretching across the gap like tiny bridges that would support the cross threads to come. Each thread was laid with careful attention to tension, tight enough to be secure, loose enough to avoid puckering the surrounding fabric. The crossing threads came next, woven alternately over and under the foundation threads in a pattern that mimicked the original cloth's structure. Agnes's needle moved with the rhythm of meditation, each pass requiring attention while allowing her mind to drift to thoughts of the day's small pleasures and tomorrow's necessary tasks. The work was soothing in its predictability, its outcome certain if patience and skill were properly applied. Mary watched her mother's hands with fascination, beginning to understand that mending was both craft and art, requiring knowledge that went far beyond simply pulling thread through fabric. The placement of each stitch, the choice of materials, the techniques used to match existing patterns, all required understanding gained through years of practice and observation. The child was absorbing lessons that no book could teach, skills that would serve her throughout her life. As the darn progressed, the tear gradually disappeared beneath a network of threads that would soon be indistinguishable from the original fabric. Agnes's stitches were so small and even that the repair would be nearly invisible when complete, detectable only by someone who knew exactly where to look. This was not vanity but practicality, a mend that drew attention to itself, advertised either poverty or poor craftsmanship, neither acceptable in a community where appearance often determined social standing. The completed repair represented more than simple restoration. Through her patient work, Agnes had extended her gown's useful life by months or perhaps years, postponing the day when replacement would become necessary. In a world where new clothing required enormous investments of time and materials, such postponement was itself a form of wealth creation, turning skill and patience into tangible value. But mending offered rewards beyond mere economy. There was satisfaction in the work itself, pleasure in the transformation of damaged into whole, broken into beautiful. Agnes found peace in these quiet evening hours when the day's urgent tasks were complete, and she could focus entirely on the methodical work of repair and restoration. The rhythm of stitching was meditative, the progress visible and satisfying in ways that many of her daily tasks were not. The tradition of mending connected Agnes to generations of women who had performed similar work under similar circumstances. Her grandmother had sat in this same corner of the cottage, though in an earlier version rebuilt several times over the decades, working by firelight to extend the life of garments that represented her family's primary defense against the elements. The skills passed from hand to hand, eye to eye, memory to memory, creating an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back to the beginning of human civilization. Thomas appreciated his wife's mending skills not just for their practical value, but for the care they represented. When he put on a shirt that Agnes had repaired, he felt wrapped not just in fabric, but in love, protected not just by wool or linen, but by the attention of someone who valued his comfort and well-being. The invisible hours she spent maintaining their clothes were investments in their family's dignity and health, contributions that could not be measured in coins, but were nonetheless precious beyond calculation. The mending session would often extend beyond simple repairs to include preventive maintenance, reinforcing areas of stress before they failed, replacing worn ties and fastenings, adjusting fit as bodies changed with age and season. Agnes's experienced eye could spot potential problems long before they became serious, her interventions extending garment life while maintaining comfort and appearance. As the evening progressed and the mending was completed, Agnes would fold her work carefully, returning tools to their proper places and setting aside scraps that might prove useful for future projects. The mended gown would go back into service the next morning, its small crisis resolved through patience and skill, its useful life extended through the application of knowledge as old as civilization itself. The gentle hands that wielded needle and thread were the same hands that kneaded bread, tended gardens, comforted children, and performed the countless tasks that sustained daily life. But in these quiet moments of mending, they became instruments of a different kind of creation, not making new, but restoring old, not building but rebuilding, not creating but recreating. In the soft firelight, with Mary beside her learning these essential skills, Agnes embodied the patient heart that found joy in small perfections, satisfaction in work well done, and beauty in the simple act of making things whole again. The economy of medieval peasant life was measured not in coins, but in the careful preservation of everything that possessed value, and nowhere was this more evident than in the relationship between a family and their clothing. Agnes had learned from her mother, as her mother had learned from hers, that the secret to survival lay not in acquiring more, but in making what you had last longer, stretch further, serve better. Every thread was precious, every scrap of fabric a potential treasure, every worn garment a source of materials for something new. In the chest beside her bed, Agnes kept what she privately called her treasure box, a smaller wooden container. That held the accumulated remnants of a lifetime's worth of clothing. Here were pieces of her wedding dress, carefully saved when the gown itself had worn beyond repair. The blue wool still rich with memory despite its faded color. Strips of linen from Thomas's first shirt, cut away when the body had worn thin but the sleeves remained sound. Scraps from Mary's baby clothes, too small now but too precious to discard entirely. These fragments told the story of her family's textile life, each piece carrying memories as vivid as its colors. The red wool that had once been her festival gown now served as patches for Thomas's working clothes, its bright hue adding spots of unexpected beauty to garments that valued durability over appearance. The soft linen from a long-ago christening dress had been transformed into handkerchiefs and cleaning cloths, its fine weave making it perfect for delicate tasks. Agnes had become an artist of transformation, able to see potential in the most unlikely materials. A worn-out shirt could provide fabric for children's undergarments, its softest sections repurposed, while the more damaged areas became cleaning rags or padding for quilts. Sleeves that outlasted their bodies became leg coverings for winter wear, their tailored shape adapted to new purposes with minimal alteration. The process of salvaging useful materials from worn garments was almost ceremonial in its thoroughness. Agnes would spread the damaged piece on her bed, examining every inch to determine what could be saved and how it might best be used. The seams were opened with care, each stitch removed cleanly to avoid damaging the fabric. Buttons, ties, and fastenings were saved in small containers, sorted by size and type for future use. Even the most damaged fabrics found new life in Agnes's capable hands. Wool that had worn too thin for clothing became stuffing for cushions and mattresses, its insulating properties undiminished despite its inability to hold together under stress. Linen reduced to rags served essential purposes in a household where every cleaning task required reusable materials. Nothing was truly waste unless it had been used beyond all possibility of further service. The children learned these lessons of conservation through daily example rather than formal instruction. Mary had absorbed the understanding that every scrap of fabric was potentially valuable, every worn garment a source of raw materials for future projects. She watched her mother's careful dismantling of worn clothing with the attention of a scholar studying sacred texts, understanding that these skills would determine her own family's survival in years to come. The art of making little last forever extended beyond simple reuse to the more complex process of combining materials from different sources to create something entirely new. Agnes had become expert at matching colors and textures, able to piece together garments from disparate scraps that somehow achieved harmony in their final form. A skirt might incorporate wool from 3 different sources, its patchwork construction, invisible beneath careful arrangement and skillful sewing. The planning required for such projects was considerable, often extending over months or even years, as Agnes accumulated the materials needed for a particular garment. She kept mental inventories of her fabric stores, knowing exactly what colors and textures were available and in what quantities. When an opportunity arose to acquire additional materials, perhaps from a neighbor whose family had suffered loss, or from her own salvage operations, she could instantly evaluate how they might fit into her long-term plans. Winter evenings provided the time needed for the most complex transformation projects. By firelight, Agnes would work on elaborate constructions that combined salvaged materials with new elements, creating garments that served immediate needs while preserving precious resources for future use. The work required not just skill with needle and thread, but an understanding of how different fabrics would behave when combined, how colors would appear together, how various weights and textures could be made to work in harmony. Thomas had learned to appreciate his wife's economy not just for its practical benefits but for the creativity it fostered. A shirt that incorporated fabric from 4 different sources was not just clothing but art, its successful construction proof of Agnes's skill and ingenuity. He wore such garments with pride, understanding that their complex construction represented resources carefully husbanded and skills expertly applied. The village community supported this culture of conservation through informal networks of exchange and sharing. When a family suffered misfortune that left them with clothing needs they couldn't meet, neighbors would contribute materials from their own stores, understanding that such generosity might be reciprocated when their own circumstances required assistance. Agnes had both given and received such help, participating in a system of mutual aid that strengthened community bonds while addressing individual needs. Children's clothing presented particular challenges and opportunities in this system of careful conservation. The rapid growth of young bodies meant that garments had short, useful lives for their original purposes, but Agnes had developed techniques for extending size ranges and adapting fits that could add months or even years to a garment's service. Hems could be let down, seams let out, sleeves extended, and waistlines adjusted to accommodate changing dimensions. The transformation of adult clothing into children's garments was an art form in itself, requiring skills that combined tailoring with creative problem-solving. A woman's gown could be redesigned to provide clothing for several children, its fabric cut and rearranged to create garments appropriate for different ages and purposes. The process required careful planning to ensure that the original garment's best features were preserved while adapting its structure to serve new needs. Agnes had developed particular expertise in the reverse process as well, taking children's outgrown garments and incorporating their materials into adult clothing. The finest fabrics from festival dresses that had been outgrown could add decorative elements to more practical garments, their bright colors and soft textures providing beauty that elevated everyday clothing above mere utility. The economics of this system were complex but undeniable. By extending the useful life of clothing through careful maintenance, creative adaptation, and strategic reuse, Agnes could provide her family with adequate clothing on resources that might otherwise have proven insufficient. The time invested in these activities was considerable, but the alternative, purchasing new garments, was often impossible given their economic circumstances. But the value of this careful husbandry extended beyond mere economics. In learning to see potential in damaged materials, to find beauty in combinations of disparate elements, to create something useful from resources others might discard, Agnes was developing skills and attitudes that served her family in all aspects of their life. The patience required for careful mending, the creativity needed for successful adaptation, the planning necessary for long-term resource management, all were qualities that strengthened their ability to thrive despite limited means. The satisfaction Agnes found in these activities was genuine and deep. There was pleasure in the successful completion of a complex transformation project, joy in discovering that materials she had saved months ago proved perfect for a current need, pride in garments that served their wearers well despite their complex histories. The work connected her to traditions of female creativity and resourcefulness that stretched back through countless generations. As evening fell and Agnes prepared for her nightly ritual of folding and storing her precious garments, she felt the weight of all the stories they carried, not just her own experiences, but the accumulated history of materials that had served multiple purposes, lived multiple lives, found new meanings through careful preservation and creative transformation. In making little last forever, she was participating in humanity's ancient struggle against scarcity, finding abundance through ingenuity rather than acquisition. Her hands, as they moved through the familiar motions of preparing for rest, carried the memory of countless hours spent in this patient work of preservation and transformation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to exercise these skills, new chances to demonstrate that human creativity could triumph over material limitations. Tonight, surrounded by the evidence of her careful stewardship, Agnes found peace in the knowledge that she had mastered the art of making little last forever. And as you listen to this tale of careful hands and patient hearts, perhaps you too can find comfort in the knowledge that true abundance comes not from having more, but from caring well for what we have, from seeing possibility in the overlooked, from finding beauty in the simple act of making things last, just a little longer, serve just a little better, carry us just a little further on our journey through this world. On the highest shelf of Agnes's wooden chest, wrapped in the finest linen she possessed, lay a treasure that transcended mere clothing and entered the realm of legacy. It was her grandmother's wedding kirtle, a garment of such exquisite craftsmanship and historical significance that it had been worn by 4 generations of brides each adding their own careful stitches to preserve it for daughters, yet unborn. The linen was the color of old ivory, its surface soft as silk from years of gentle handling, its construction a testament to skills that seemed almost magical in their precision. Agnes lifted the precious garment with reverence, unfolding its carefully preserved layers to examine the intricate embroidery that adorned its neckline and sleeves. The needlework was so fine it seemed to have been drawn rather than stitched, depicting flowers and vines in threads of gold and silk that caught the morning light like captured sunshine. Each tiny leaf and petal had been worked with a precision that spoke of countless hours spent in patient labor, winter evenings when her great-grandmother had sat by the fire, creating beauty that would outlast her own brief span of years. The kirtle's construction revealed secrets of a textile tradition that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that true luxury lay not in quantity, but in quality beyond measure. The linen itself had been woven from flax of extraordinary fineness, its threads so evenly spun and perfectly tensioned that the finished cloth seemed almost to glow within a light. The weaving was so tight and regular that even after decades of careful use, the fabric showed no signs of weakness or wear. Mary stood beside her mother, her young eyes wide with wonder as she gazed upon the legendary garment that would someday be hers to preserve and protect. Agnes had begun telling her daughter the story of the wedding kirtle when the child was old enough to understand the difference between ordinary clothes and treasures that carried the weight of family history. Each time she displayed the garment, the story grew richer with details that connected their small family to a larger narrative of love, loss, hope, and continuity. The embroidery thread, Agnes explained to her daughter, had been purchased at great expense from a merchant who travelled the trade routes connecting their isolated village to the great cities of Europe. The gold thread was real metal, beaten so thin it could be wound around silk cores and stitched like ordinary thread, its cost representing perhaps a month's income for a peasant family. The silk threads in shades of rose and green had come from even further away, their exotic origins making them precious beyond the reach of most village families. Agnes's great-grandmother had earned the money for these luxurious materials through her own exceptional needlework, taking commissions from the wives of merchants and minor nobility who recognized her skill and were willing to pay handsomely for embroidery that rivaled work produced in the finest convents and noble households. The wedding kirtle had been both culmination and advertisement of her abilities, a masterpiece that demonstrated what human hands could achieve when skill met determination and infinite patience. The pattern of the embroidery told its own story, incorporating symbols that carried meaning beyond mere decoration. The roses represented love and fertility, their 5 petals arranged according to ancient traditions that were supposed to ensure a happy marriage and many children. The vine that connected the flowers symbolized the continuity of family lines, its endless curves suggesting the eternal cycle of birth, growth, marriage, and renewal that defined human existence. Hidden within the decorative elements were protective symbols that reflected the medieval understanding of the supernatural forces that influence daily life. A tiny horseshoe, worked in gold thread, so fine it was nearly invisible, was meant to bring good luck to the marriage. A small cross, its arms perfectly proportioned despite its minute size, invoked divine protection for the bride and her future family. These elements had been incorporated so skillfully into the overall design that they appeared to be merely decorative unless one knew where to look and what to seek. The construction of the kirtle itself demonstrated techniques that had taken Agnes's great-grandmother years to master. The seams were so fine they seemed to have been joined by magic rather than needle and thread, their stitches invisible from both sides of the garment. The neckline was finished with a technique called drawn thread work, where threads had been carefully removed from the fabric, and the remaining threads regrouped into patterns that created openwork decoration of breathtaking delicacy. Agnes had worn the kirtle for her own wedding. 15 years earlier, the precious garment transformed her from village girl into bride worthy of the ceremony that would define the rest of her life. She remembered the weight of responsibility she had felt that day, understanding that she was not merely wearing a beautiful dress, but accepting custody of a family treasure that connected her to generations of women who had faced similar moments of transition and transformation. The alterations required to fit each successive bride had been made with surgical precision, every adjustment carefully planned to preserve the garment's essential character, while accommodating differences in size and proportion. The techniques used for these modifications were themselves a form of advanced needlework, requiring skills that few seamstresses possessed. Agnes had learned these methods from her mother, who had adjusted the kirtle for her own wedding and later taught her daughter the secrets of invisible alteration. Thomas had been awed by his bride's appearance in the wedding kirtle, understanding that the garment elevated their simple village ceremony into something approaching the grandeur of noble weddings. The kirtle's obvious value and exquisite craftsmanship reflected honor on both families, demonstrating that skill and care could all create beauty that rivaled the finest products of wealthy households. His pride in his bride's appearance had been mixed with humility at being considered worthy of someone who could claim such family treasures. The preservation of the wedding kirtle required knowledge and techniques that went far beyond the care given to ordinary clothing. Agnes stored it wrapped in lavender-scented linen, understanding that certain insects were attracted to fine textiles and that aromatic herbs could provide protection without damaging delicate fibers. The garment was aired regularly but carefully, exposed to gentle sunlight that could refresh the fabric while avoiding harsh rays that might fade the precious embroidery threads. Each handling of the kirtle was planned and purposeful. The garment, examined for any signs of deterioration that might require immediate attention. Agnes had already identified several areas where minute repairs would soon be necessary, her trained eye detecting weakness that might escape casual observation. These repairs would require threads that matched the original materials exactly, a challenge that might take months to meet through careful searching and patient negotiation with suppliers. The wedding kirtle represented more than family history. It was a repository of technical knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Each time Agnes examined its construction, she discovered new details that revealed the sophistication of her great-grandmother's skills. The way seams were finished, the method used to attach the embroidery, the techniques employed to create perfectly even gathering, all provided lessons that enriched her own understanding of textile arts. The emotional weight of the kirtle was perhaps even greater than its material value. When Agnes held the garment, she felt connected to the women who had worn it before her, their hopes and dreams somehow preserved in the threads that had witnessed their most important day. The kirtle carried within its folds the echoes of prayers, whispered on wedding mornings, tears of joy and nervousness, the whispered promises of love that had been spoken while its embroidery caught the light of chapel candles. As Agnes carefully refolded the precious garment and returned it to its place of honor, she was already planning the day when it would be lifted from its wrappings to clothe another bride. Mary was still years away from marriage, but Agnes had begun teaching her daughter the skills that would be required to preserve and maintain the family treasure. The knowledge would be passed from hand to hand as it had been for generations, ensuring that beauty created with love and skill would continue to serve future generations. The wedding kirtle represented the medieval understanding that true wealth lay not in accumulating possessions, but in creating things of such quality and meaning that they could transcend their original purpose to become links between past and future. In preserving this garment, Agnes was preserving more than fabric and thread. She was maintaining a connection to family history, protecting a repository of skills and traditions, and ensuring that beauty born of love and labor would continue to bring joy to generations yet unborn. As Agnes worked in her garden on a warm September morning, the familiar comfort of her woolen gown moving with her body, she was unconsciously carrying the history of her family's textile life in every thread and patch that comprised her daily costume. The garment that protected her from thorns and sun, that dignified her labor and marked her place in the village hierarchy, was itself a manuscript written in stitches and seams, telling stories that spanned decades of careful living and creative adaptation. The left sleeve of her gown bore a patch that recalled the terrible winter when Mary had been ill with fever, and Agnes had spent night after night sitting beside the child's bed, wearing the same dress for weeks because changing clothes might disturb the careful watch she maintained. The wool had worn thin at the elbow where she had leaned against the rough wooden chair, and when spring finally came with news of recovery, the damage required repair that became commemoration of those anxious weeks. Agnes had chosen the patch material carefully, selecting brown wool that was slightly darker than the original fabric, but harmonious in tone and texture. The patch itself was cut in the shape of a stylized leaf, its edges carefully turned and stitched with thread that matched so perfectly it seemed to have grown naturally in the wool. The repair was so skillfully executed that it appeared to be deliberate decoration rather than necessity, transforming damage into beauty through the application of skill and imagination. The hem of the gown told a different story, its current length the result of multiple adjustments made as Agnes's circumstances and needs had changed over the years. Originally, the gown had been cut long enough to brush the ground in the fashion favored by women who could afford to keep their garments clean despite impractical length. But practical considerations had soon required shortening, and Agnes had carefully removed several inches of fabric while preserving the original hemline's graceful curve. The fabric removed from the hem had not been wasted, but carefully preserved, eventually finding new life as patches and trim for other garments. Agnes could point to places on Thomas's working clothes where strips of her gown's original hem now served to reinforce areas of stress, the brown wool adding strength while creating subtle decorative elements that elevated utility clothing above mere functionality. Near the gown's waistline, hidden beneath the belt that defined her silhouette, lay evidence of the year when poor harvests had left the family with reduced rations, and Agnes had lost more weight than was healthy. The gown, originally fitted to her fuller figure, had required taking in at the seams to maintain proper fit and appearance. The alteration had been performed so skillfully that no external evidence remained, but Agnes could feel the modified seams against her body, reminders of a difficult time that had tested their family's resilience. The neckline of the gown bore traces of multiple repairs and adjustments, the fabric there subject to more wear than other areas because of its constant contact with the wimple and the natural oils of her skin. Agnes had reinforced the neckline with strips of linen that were invisible when covered by her head covering, but provided essential strength to an area that otherwise would have failed years ago. The reinforcement was itself a display of technique, the linen strips attached with stitches so fine they seemed to have been drawn rather than sewn. Thomas occasionally traced these repairs with his finger when they sat together by the fire in the evenings reading the history of their shared life in the modifications and adaptations that marked Agnes's gown. Each patch and alteration recalled specific events, particular challenges that had been met and overcome through ingenuity and determination. The garment had become a textile autobiography, its accumulated changes creating a record more intimate and immediate than any written chronicle. Mary was learning to read these stories, her young eyes trained to notice the subtle differences in thread and fabric that marked each repair. Agnes used the gown as a teaching tool, explaining the techniques and reasoning behind each modification, while demonstrating how problems could become opportunities for creative expression. The child was absorbing lessons about patience, skill, and the transformation of necessity into beauty that would serve her throughout her life. The right shoulder of the gown bore a patch that commemorated the day Agnes had helped deliver her neighbor's baby, when her eager assistance had resulted in a tear from the excited mother's fingernails. The repair had been made with fabric saved from the baby's first dress, creating a connection between the garment and the life she had helped bring into the world. Each time Agnes wore the gown, she was reminded of that day's joy and her role in the continuing cycle of village life. The pockets that Agnes had added to the gown's construction were themselves innovations born of practical need, their placement and construction designed to carry the tools and materials necessary for her daily work without disrupting the garment's appearance or function. The pockets were lined with linen that was regularly washed and replaced, protecting the wool from stains and wear, while providing secure storage for the small items that defined her working life. One pocket bore evidence of the time she had carried herbs for a sick neighbor, the fabric still faintly stained with the green juice of healing plants that had been crushed during transport. Agnes had tried to remove the stains with techniques passed down from her mother, but some marks had proven permanent, becoming part of the garment's accumulated history rather than flaws to be hidden or regretted. The back seam of the gown had been opened and re-sewn twice, once to accommodate the changes in her figure during pregnancy, and again to adjust the fit after Mary's birth had left her body subtly altered. Each reconstruction had been performed with care to preserve the garment's structural integrity while adapting to physical realities that demanded accommodation. The modifications were invisible to casual observation, but represented hours of careful work performed during the precious few leisure moments available to a working mother. Agnes had developed her own techniques for invisible repair, methods that went beyond what her mother had taught her to address the specific challenges posed by her particular circumstances and needs. She had learned to match not just colors, but the way different batches of dye aged and faded, understanding that a perfect initial match might become obvious as time revealed differences in how various materials responded to washing and wear. The sleeves of the gown showed evidence of multiple adjustments made, as fashion had subtly evolved during the years of the garment's service. What had once been considered appropriate width had gradually become too full for current standards, requiring careful taking in that preserved the sleeve's essential character while adapting to changing expectations. The modifications had been so skillfully executed that the sleeves appeared to have been cut in their current proportions from the beginning. Each repair represented not just technical skill, but emotional investment, time and care devoted to preserving something valuable in more than monetary terms. Agnes had learned to find satisfaction in the work itself, pleasure in the challenge of matching materials and techniques to specific problems, joy in the transformation of damaged into beautiful. The accumulated repairs had made the gown uniquely hers, shaped by her hands and marked by her experiences in ways that no new garment could replicate. As evening approached and Agnes prepared for the familiar ritual of folding and storing her precious clothing, she reflected on the stories that each seam and patch carried forward into another day. Tomorrow the gown would accompany her through new experiences, perhaps acquiring new marks or requiring new repairs that would add chapters to its ongoing narrative. In caring for this garment with such attention and skill, she was not merely maintaining clothing, but preserving a record of her life's journey, creating a textile memoir that spoke more eloquently than words of resilience, creativity, and the profound human capacity to find beauty in the most practical aspects of existence. In the soft silver light that streamed through Agnes's window on clear nights, her carefully folded garments seemed to take on lives of their own, their pale surfaces catching and reflecting the moon's gentle radiance like still water holds the stars. The linen kirtle, positioned at the top of her wooden chest, where it would be first to greet the morning, glowed with an ethereal luminescence that transformed humble cloth into something approaching the magical, its ivory surface marked with shadows that told stories of careful hands and patient heart. Agnes often found herself pausing in her nightly preparations to admire this transformation, the way moonlight could make familiar things seem touched by wonder. Her practical mind understood that the effect was simply light reflecting off pale fabric, but her heart responded to the beauty with the appreciation of someone who found poetry in the most ordinary aspects of daily life. The kirtle, which had seemed merely useful in daylight, became mysterious and beautiful in the moon's gentle illumination. The linen itself carried within its weave the memory of summer fields where flax had grown tall and straight under the sun's warm blessing. Agnes could almost see those distant meadows in the cloth's pale surface, could almost hear the whisper of wind through the growing plants that had given their fibers to create this garment. The transformation from plant to cloth to clothing was so complete that it was easy to forget the agricultural origins of what seemed like purely human creation. Mary lay sleeping in her small bed, her own simple garments folded with the same care her mother showed to her more elaborate possessions. The child's clothes seemed especially poignant in the moonlight, their small size emphasizing how quickly childhood passed and how briefly any garment would serve its original purpose. Agnes had already begun planning the modifications that would be necessary as Mary grew, the ways in which current clothes could be adapted to serve changing needs. The cotton that Agnes had recently acquired from a traveling merchant seemed to glow with particular intensity in the lunar light, its unfamiliar fibers reflecting illumination in ways that differed subtly from the linen and wool that comprised most of her textile collection. Cotton was still exotic in their part of England, expensive enough that Agnes had been able to afford only a small piece, but its softness and fineness made it precious beyond its cost. She had purchased the cotton with money saved over months of careful economizing, each coin preserved from small transactions and minor luxuries foregone. The fabric was intended for a special project, perhaps trim for Mary's festival dress, or a fine kerchief that could be worn on occasions when appearance mattered more than mere utility. The cotton's foreign origins made it seem touched by magic, connected to distant lands and exotic peoples that existed mostly in the realm of imagination. The moonlight revealed textures and patterns that were invisible in stronger illumination, showing the subtle variations in weave and thread that marked handmade fabric as different from machine-produced cloth. Agnes's trained eye could read these variations like text, understanding how they spoke of the spinner's skill, the weaver's attention, the countless small decisions that had shaped raw materials into useful objects. In the silver light, even, the patches and repairs that marked her gown service seemed beautiful rather than merely practical. The careful matching of threads and fabrics that was essential for invisible repair became artistry when viewed in moonlight that softened differences and harmonized disparities. What had been necessity transformed into decoration, utility became beauty, function, evolved into form that pleased the eye as well as serving practical needs. Agnes remembered her grandmother's stories of moon-blessed linen, fabric that had been bleached under the full moon's light to achieve whiteness impossible through sun bleaching alone. The process required patience and perfect timing, the cloth spread on grass wet with dew and left to absorb the moon's gentle radiance through entire nights. The resulting linen was said to be not just whiter, but somehow blessed, protected by lunar influence from staining and rapid wear. Whether or not such beliefs held truth beyond superstition, Agnes appreciated the beauty of the practice, the way it connected the practical work of textile care to the larger rhythms of the natural world. The moon that blessed linen was the same moon that governed tides and seasons, that marked time and influenced the cycles of growth and rest that defined agricultural life. To work with lunar rhythms was to acknowledge humanity's place in patterns larger than individual existence. The dreams that visited Agnes in the moonlit hours often featured textiles that exceeded anything possible in waking life. She dreamed of cloth woven from moonbeams and starlight, of garments that changed color with the wearer's emotions, of fabrics so fine they seemed to be made of captured mist. These nocturnal visions were both escape and inspiration, suggesting possibilities that challenged her to improve her own skills and expand her understanding of what could be achieved through patient labor and creative vision. Thomas slept deeply. Beside her, his breathing regular and peaceful in the way that came from physical exhaustion honestly earned. His own clothes, folded with equal care on his side of the chest, seemed to tell stories of labor and responsibility in the moonlight's revealing glow. The patches that marked his working garments spoke of tasks completed and challenges met, of a life lived in service to family and community. The village around them lay quiet under the moon's gentle watch, other families sleeping in cottages where similar rituals of textile care were performed with equal devotion. Agnes felt connected to this community of women who understood the value of careful preservation, who found satisfaction in the skills that sustained their family's comfort and dignity. The moonlight that illuminated her possessions shone equally on neighbors who shared her values and commitments. Sometimes Agnes would carry her mending to the window on bright nights, using the moon's clear light to guide her needle through repairs that were too delicate for firelight. The work proceeded slowly in the gentle illumination, but the quality was often better than what could be achieved in stronger light that cast harsh shadows and created deceptive contrasts. Moonlight mending became a special skill, requiring different techniques and offering different satisfactions than work performed in daylight. The cotton's exotic origins made it seem especially appropriate for moonlight contemplation, its foreign character enhanced by illumination that made familiar things strange and ordinary objects mysterious. Agnes wondered about the women in distant lands who had grown and processed the cotton, whether they too performed nightly rituals of folding and preservation, whether they found similar satisfaction in the careful tending of precious textiles. The lunar light revealed details in her embroidery that were lost in other illumination, showing how threads caught and reflected light differently according to their composition and the direction of their twist. The effect was subtle but beautiful, creating depth and movement in decorative work that seemed flat in harsher light. Agnes made mental notes about these observations, planning to experiment with thread placement and selection to enhance these moonlight effects in future projects. As the night progressed and the moon traced its ancient path across the sky, Agnes found herself grateful for these quiet moments of appreciation and reflection. The moonlight that transformed her humble possessions into objects of beauty was the same light that had blessed countless generations of women who had performed similar rituals of care and preservation. In folding her clothes with reverence and storing them with love, she was participating in traditions as old as human civilization, connecting her daily labor to practices that transcended individual existence to become part of humanity's continuing story. The dreams that would visit her sleep would be colored by these moonlit meditations, filled with images of fabric and thread, of hands that worked with patience, and hearts that found joy in simple perfections. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, new chances to exercise the skills that transformed necessity into beauty, function into art. Tonight, in the moon's gentle blessing, she found peace in the knowledge that her small contributions to the great work of human survival and creativity were noticed and honored by the same celestial influences that had watched over countless others who had walked this path before her. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the window of Agnes's cottage, the familiar ritual of morning preparation began with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed by centuries of custom. The wooden chest opened with a whisper, of hinges that had been smoothed by daily use, releasing the scent of lavender and wool, linen and memory that had accumulated in the careful darkness of storage. Each garment lay exactly where it had been placed the night before, folded with such precision that not a wrinkle disturbed their waiting perfection. Agnes rose slowly from the warmth of her bed, her body moving with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that haste in the morning ritual could damage precious fabrics or create disorder that would affect the entire day. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet, but she had learned to welcome this sensation as a reminder of her body's awakening, a gentle signal that another day of useful labor was beginning. The kirtle came first, lifted from its place, with hands that could work in near darkness. So familiar was she with the location and condition of every garment. The linen felt cool and smooth against her skin, its texture a pleasure that she never took for granted despite experiencing it every morning for years. As she pulled the garment over her head, she felt the familiar comfort of being properly covered, protected not just by fabric, but by the accumulated care and skill that had created and maintained this essential piece of clothing. The ties that secured the kirtle at her waist required attention to tension and placement, ensuring that the garment hung properly while allowing freedom of movement for the work that lay ahead. Agnes had learned through experience exactly how tight these fastenings should be, how to achieve security without restriction, comfort without carelessness. Her fingers worked automatically, muscle memory guiding the process, while her mind began to organize the tasks that would fill the coming day. Mary stirred in her small bed, her young body responding to the subtle sounds and movements that marked her mother's morning routine. At 8 years old, she was beginning to participate in this daily ritual, learning through observation and gradual involvement the skills that would serve her throughout her life. Agnes watched her daughter's awakening with satisfaction, seeing in the child's growing competence the continuation of knowledge that connected their family to generations of women who had performed similar rituals. The woolen gown followed, its weight substantial and reassuring, as Agnes lifted it from the chest where it had rested through the night. The wool had absorbed moisture from the air, becoming slightly heavier and more pliable than it had been when stored, ready to conform to her body's movements with the cooperation that came from proper care and storage. She had learned to read these subtle changes in her clothing, understanding how different fabrics responded to varying conditions of temperature and humidity. The process of putting on the gown required careful attention to its fall and drape, ensuring that the wool hung properly from her shoulders and that the sleeves arranged themselves without twisting or bunching. Agnes moved with unconscious skill, her hands smoothing the fabric and adjusting its position with movements that had been refined through years of practice. The gown settled around her like a familiar embrace, its weight and warmth preparing her for whatever challenges the day might bring. Thomas had awakened and begun his own dressing ritual, his movements equally practiced, but different in their emphasis on durability and protection rather than grace and propriety. His working clothes bore the marks of hard labor, their construction and repair focused on functionality rather than appearance, though Agnes's careful maintenance ensured that even his most utilitarian garments possessed dignity appropriate to his position in the community. The wimple required special attention, its white linen needing to be positioned correctly to frame her face while covering her hair completely. Agnes had learned to judge the proper placement by feel as much as sight, understanding how the fabric should fall and fold to achieve the effect demanded by custom and modesty. The pins that secured the wimple were placed with care to avoid damaging the delicate linen while ensuring that the covering would remain in place throughout the day's activities. The belt that defined her waistline and secured her gown's proper fit was more than mere functional accessory. It was a symbol of her status as a married woman, its presence marking her place in the social hierarchy that governed village life. Agnes had woven the belt herself from wool dyed deep brown to match her gown, its construction demonstrating skills that elevated utility into artistry. The belt's wear pattern told the story of years of daily service, its surface polished smooth by constant contact with her hands. As the dressing ritual neared completion, Agnes performed a final inspection of her appearance, ensuring that every element was properly positioned and that her clothing would serve her well through the day's demands. This was not vanity, but prudence. Clothing that was incorrectly worn could be damaged by the day's activities, while proper arrangement ensured maximum service life and appropriate appearance for her interactions with neighbors and community members. Mary had risen and begun her own simplified version of the morning ritual, her small hands working with increasing skill to arrange her simple garments appropriately. Agnes watched her daughter's progress with pride and patience, understanding that the child was learning lessons that extended far beyond mere clothing care to encompass values of order, respect for possessions, and the importance of proper preparation for daily responsibilities. The morning light grew stronger as the dressing ritual concluded, revealing the cottage in the clarity that made inspection and planning possible. Agnes could see the tasks that awaited her attention. Bread to be baked, gardens to be tended, household maintenance that required her skills and energy. But she faced these responsibilities with confidence, properly clothed and prepared for whatever the day might demand. The completed ritual left Agnes feeling not just dressed, but armored for the day's challenges, protected by clothing that had been created and maintained with love and skill. Each garment served multiple purposes. The kirtle provided comfort and modesty, the gown offered warmth and dignity, the wimple ensured propriety and protection. Together they created a complete ensemble that would serve her needs while reflecting her family's values and social position. Thomas had completed his own preparations and stood ready to begin the outdoor work that would occupy much of his day. His appearance reflected the same attention to proper dress that characterized Agnes's routine, understanding that clothing served purposes beyond mere protection to include communication about character, status, and respect for community standards. The care they both took in their morning preparations was investment in their family's reputation and their own self-respect. As the family prepared to begin another day in the endless cycle of labor and rest that defined their existence, Agnes felt gratitude for the clothing that would accompany her through whatever lay ahead. The morning dance of dressing was complete, but its effects would last throughout the day, providing comfort, protection, and the quiet confidence that came from being properly prepared for life's demands. The ritual itself was both beginning and continuation, starting another day while perpetuating traditions that connected their family to the larger human community that shared similar values and practices. In dressing with care and attention, Agnes was not merely covering her body but participating in customs that had sustained human dignity and social order for countless generations. The morning dance of dressing was celebration disguised as necessity, art expressed through the most practical of human needs. As Agnes reached the end of another day, her weathered hands moving through the familiar ritual of folding and storing her precious garments, she understood that she was participating in something far greater than simple maintenance of clothing. Each careful fold represented a choice to value what she possessed. Each gentle placement in the wooden chest was an act of faith that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to wear these carefully tended garments, another chance to find dignity and comfort in possessions that had been shaped by love and sustained by skill. The evening light streaming through her window caught the worn places in her woolen gown as she lifted it over her head, revealing the accumulated history of a life lived with purpose and care. The fabric, soft from years of gentle handling, seemed to whisper stories as it passed through her fingers. Tales of harvest festivals where she had danced with Thomas, of market days when she had stood proudly among her neighbors, of countless, ordinary mornings when this simple garment had transformed her from sleeping woman into productive member of her community. Agnes could read her life's journey in the wear patterns that marked the wool's surface. The slight thinning at the elbows spoke of long hours spent leaning over her work, whether spinning by the fire or tending the sick in the village. The faded areas where sunlight had touched the fabric told of days spent in her garden, coaxing vegetables from the earth while wearing the gown that had become as much a part of her identity as her own name. The act of folding had evolved over the years from mere necessity into a form of meditation, each crease and arrangement made with attention that bordered on reverence. Agnes had learned that clothing properly folded not only lasted longer but seemed to rest more peacefully, ready to serve again when morning called it back to duty. The precision of her movements reflected decades of practice, hands that had folded these same garments thousands of times, yet never treated the task as mere routine. Thomas watched his wife's nightly ritual with appreciation that had deepened rather than diminished over their years together. He understood that Agnes's careful treatment of their clothing was not vanity but wisdom, not fastidiousness but love expressed through action. The time she spent in these evening preparations was investment in their family's future, ensuring that resources carefully accumulated would be preserved and protected through seasons of scarcity and abundance alike. Mary, now old enough to participate meaningfully in the ritual, folded her own simple garments with movements that echoed her mother's technique while developing their own characteristics born of smaller hands and different perspectives. Agnes watched her daughter's progress with satisfaction, seeing in the child's growing competence the continuation of skills that had sustained their family through generations of challenge and change. The wooden chest that received their carefully folded clothing had itself aged gracefully over the years, its surfaces polished smooth by countless openings and closings, its interior seasoned with the accumulated scents of lavender and cedar, wool and linen. Thomas had carved it as a young man preparing for marriage, understanding that he was creating not just storage, but a repository for the textiles that would shelter and dignify his future family. Agnes's kirtle, folded with particular care because of its delicate linen construction, represented more than undergarment. It was the foundation upon which her daily dignity was built, the layer closest to her skin that mediated between her body and the world's demands. The linen had been woven from flax that had grown in fields she could see from her window, its fibers transformed through her own labors into cloth that served needs both practical and spiritual. The wimple, last to be removed and first to be folded, carried within its white folds the accumulated prayers of countless mornings when Agnes had covered her head in preparation for the day's work. The simple linen rectangle was more than head covering. It was symbol of her status as married woman, protection for hair that had grown grey in service to her family, badge of respectability that marked her place in the village's social order. As Agnes reached the end of another day, her weathered hands moving through the familiar ritual of folding and storing her precious garments, she understood that she was participating in something far greater than simple maintenance of clothing. Each careful fold represented a choice to value what she possessed. Each gentle placement in the wooden chest was an act of faith that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to wear these carefully tended garments, another chance to find dignity and comfort in possessions that had been shaped by love and sustained by skill. The evening light streaming through her window caught the worn places in her woolen gown as she lifted it over her head, revealing the accumulated history of a life lived with purpose and care. The fabric, soft from years of gentle handling, seemed to whisper stories as it passed through her fingers. Tales of harvest festivals where she had danced with Thomas, of market days when she had stood proudly among her neighbors, of countless, ordinary mornings when this simple garment had transformed her from sleeping woman into productive member of her community. Agnes could read her life's journey in the wear patterns that marked the wool's surface. The slight thinning at the elbows spoke of long hours spent leaning over her work, whether spinning by the fire or tending the sick in the village. The faded areas where sunlight had touched the fabric told of days spent in her garden, coaxing vegetables from the earth while wearing the gown that had become as much a part of her identity as her own name. The act of folding had evolved over the years from mere necessity into a form of meditation, each crease and arrangement made with attention that bordered on reverence. Agnes had learned that clothing properly folded not only lasted longer but seemed to rest more peacefully, ready to serve again when morning called it back to duty. The precision of her movements reflected decades of practice, hands that had folded these same garments thousands of times, yet never treated the task as mere routine. Thomas watched his wife's nightly ritual with appreciation that had deepened rather than diminished over their years together. He understood that Agnes's careful treatment of their clothing was not vanity but wisdom, not fastidiousness but love expressed through action. The time she spent in these evening preparations was investment in their family's future, ensuring that resources carefully accumulated would be preserved and protected through seasons of scarcity and abundance alike. Mary, now old enough to participate meaningfully in the ritual, folded her own simple garments with movements that echoed her mother's technique while developing their own characteristics born of smaller hands and different perspectives. Agnes watched her daughter's progress with satisfaction, seeing in the child's growing competence the continuation of skills that had sustained their family through generations of challenge and change. The wooden chest that received their carefully folded clothing had itself aged gracefully over the years, its surfaces polished smooth by countless openings and closings, its interior seasoned with the accumulated scents of lavender and cedar, wool and linen. Thomas had carved it as a young man preparing for marriage, understanding that he was creating not just storage, but a repository for the textiles that would shelter and dignify his future family. Agnes's kirtle folded with particular care because of its delicate linen construction represented more than undergarment. It was the foundation upon which her daily dignity was built, the layer closest to her skin that mediated between her body and the world's demands. The linen had been woven from flax that had grown in fields she could see from her window, its fibers transformed through her own labors into cloth that served needs both practical and spiritual. The wimple, last to be removed and first to be folded, carried within its white folds the accumulated prayers of countless mornings when Agnes had covered her head in preparation for the day's work. The simple linen rectangle was more than head covering. It was symbol of her status as married woman, protection for hair that had grown grey in service to her family, badge of respectability that marked her place in the village's social order.